Following on from the release of the Ezio Collection, today we have Assassin's Creed 3 Remastered. Now this is on every console including Switch, plus a PC version, but today I thought we'd just dip in to see how the visuals compare to the last gen version. Specifically, we're going for PS4 versus PS3, with a mind to look at the Switch version in particular later on. So Assassin's Creed 3, it's the 5th game in the series, and well, I remember covering this all those years ago as a face-off before we really started doing voiceovers on videos, and boy, it takes a long time to get going. There's a whole maybe 1-2 hour stretch before the tutorials are over, so you'll have to bear with me on this one. I did only do a kind of quick sample just to get to Boston and then have a look around there. But still, it's enough to get us a sense of what the game's doing and how the remaster's taken shape. Now, there are a lot of parallels with the Ezio Collection technically in terms of the resolution bumps and the lack thereof in some respects on the Pro. More on that later, but it's definitely a worthwhile upgrade if you're looking to revisit this one.
Use. Each night it's the same. I scout one area and they drop the painted barrels from another.
So what do we have? Now the promise from Ubisoft is Assassin's Creed 3 and AC3 Liberation, which is packaged inside with it, is you get new improved textures, models, physically based rendering which affects the lighting and the way shadows work as well. The density of crowds is also meant to be boosted, I imagine, to the levels that the PC version could achieve back in the day at max. This game was running on the Anvil Next engine, which was celebrated at the time for massively boosting the density of crowds, so they really showed this off right at the start in the auditorium section at the Opera House, where there's just countless NPCs running about. So with a focus on PS4 and PS4 Pro today, let's talk resolutions. Right, so PS4 is running at a native 1920 by 1080, and if we switch over to the PS4 Pro version, it's a native 4K. Not much more to say there, it does exactly what it says on the tin, and in fairness, I would have been a bit disappointed if it was anything less, given the age of these two games. You can spot right away it is 30 frames per second, itself a little bit of a disappointment, but maybe we should have expected it given that's how the Ezio Collection panned out as well. It's also worth noting that if you're a PS4 Pro user running on a 1080p screen, you're only going to get a native 1080p from this game, unless of course you go to the menus in the PS4 system menu, go to video and then go to the super sampling option and check that, and you should get the 4K super sampling right there. But yeah, it appears to use exactly the same setup as the Ezio Collection, which at the time was a bit of a shame, but now we have the option to kind of address it manually. A bit of an oversight, but we can work around that. Now this game had a lot going for it at the time, but by today's standards it's definitely looking a bit rough around the edges. I dove into my old PS3 assets and just looked through them, and the shadows are very blocky and low res on the PS3 version in particular, and there's still object and NPC popping on the distance, partly hidden by the fact it was running at 720p at the time, but today they really had to address those things, and that they have. It's actually a decent looking game, nothing spectacular, but the move to physically based rendering is maybe the most outstanding part of it. So if we go to the comparisons between PS3 and the base PS4, we get obviously an overhaul in the materials. And every single new material in this remaster factors in things like the opacity, the roughness, the reflectivity and much more, all of which combines to give it a consistent look and a more natural look. Now to my eyes this is an improvement, but for the original a lot of this had to be coded in and baked in and basically tweaked manually by the artists at Ubisoft, which gave it a very specific look which has been completely overhauled by this point on PS4. We're playing in the standard range mode, but there is a HDR mode as well. High dynamic range is included with this one, which is a major plus, and it ties right into the PBR we've got as well. Now as far as the revamped lighting goes in practice, you can see it right away on the flags of the ship as we climb the mast here. If you look close, you can see the light seeping through the material while shadowing casts across the fabric itself. It's simply a truer to life representation of the material. Across the board, I'd say the remaster gives the whole game a lighter appearance, and it's hard to find any cases where you could see it as a step back in any way. There were artistic choices of the original game which are lost, but overall I do prefer it. It kind of reminds me of the move Dark Souls 2 took, if you remember that, with the Scholar of the First Sin upgrade. There's a sharper, more natural look to the lighting, and everything just kind of popped way more. One thing that is a little bit disappointing is the character model upgrades. I'm not convinced these are wholesale changes at all. It seems like the geometric mesh of the characters stays pretty much in place from the last gen versions, but again, what you do get there is the change to materials for the skin, the hair, the clothes. A lot of these elements are swapped around to fit in with the new lighting. So really there's not much change there, and the same goes for the objects across the world. The overall framework of the game is in place, it's just the layer over the top that's replaced. Now looking elsewhere, it's not just the textures but the shader work too. So boarding our ship, we can see like the ocean body has a new water shader running underneath it. It keeps the reflectivity aspect going, so you can see the entire ship reflected there. It's a subtler look than it was on last gen, but it is accurately mirrored there. Another aspect that I was keen to look out for is that change in player density, the number of NPCs that could appear on screen. From what I've seen running through the Boston Harbour, there is some variability here in terms of, how many NPCs really appear, where they appear, but from an eye test, I think you'll agree that there's not actually too much between them if you're looking at PS3 versus PS4. It may be the case later on the difference will be more stark in some areas, but it already was pretty high in the original, even on last gen. It was actually quite impressive it got away with as many characters as it did, especially in that Opera House area. So overall there is a promise of change, but so far I don't really see much of a difference here. So overall, I'm not sure they could have gotten away with just taking the PS3 version and just bumping up the res. They really had to go this extra mile. And while you could hardly expect it match the standards of more modern Assassin's Creed games, you're still getting an eye-catching rendition of the game as you might remember it rather than actually how it was. Now with the comparison between the base PS4 and PS4 Pro, there's not much between them besides the res. It is just a straight 1080p to 4K bump there. There's no high-res textures or anything like that to support the 4K resolution either. Indeed, this game comes to 65GB regardless of console, which in itself is a massive increase over the 11GB we had on PS3, but of course that is partly down to the fact it does include AC3 Liberation in there as well. So if we move on to the performance side, it's worth noting that the last gen versions were very unusual when they first released because they ran with an unlocked frame rate, meaning you could get a range of 20 to 40 FPS, though generally speaking when anything really intensive kicks off you're resting at about 20 FPS most of the time. It all ran V-synced but with some huge drops a lot of the way, and I remember feeling around the time of release this was far better played on PC, and really it started to become clear that we needed a new generation of consoles to really make this open world design work. And so that's exactly what we've got, though the frame rate side of things isn't really pushing the boat out too far. So looking at base PS4 first, yep, it's a V-synced 30 FPS, barely any drops for the most part. There are a few hiccups and stutters as you run around the Boston area, but generally speaking, pretty happy with that. As long as you're good with 30 FPS, this runs perfectly fine. I think there was one drop to 25 FPS at one turn, but it was a sort of one-off. And likewise, if we skip over to the PS4 Pro version, there's no real ambition to hit 60 FPS here again. It's just a straight 30 FPS cap with a few one-frame dips, but that's about it. So overall, a very serviceable take on the game, and I think if you're looking to bridge the gap between the recently released Ezio collection and the more modern Assassin's Creed games, also worth noting this game still has its fair share of glitches, just sort of basic visual stuff, oddities in the ways NPCs move, though there have been gameplay tweaks to improve the overall quality of life of playing the game.
Did you think you could escape from London so easily after what you did at the opera? That we wouldn't notice? That we wouldn't follow?
Maybe the more fascinating prospect is the Switch version, which we'll be covering in due course over the next week. Clearly though, Ubisoft is very intent on going through its back catalogue to revive a lot of the old experiences we had and bring them up to date. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what you'd like to see next in terms of a remaster from Assassin's Creed or any of Ubisoft's other major franchises of that generation. But for me for now, that's about it. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give me a like or subscribe, and of course don't forget to hit the bell to get notifications as any video lands. Also, we have this video on our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in contact with me or the team, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.